Okay, guys, I'm here to help you out with this hackathon project thing, right? So, first of all, you need to find a data set that has some values. Numeric values are really good. I think there's a nutrition one that was really good that they did an example of on code.org. I liked roller coaster facts. I'll show you the data. So there's tons of, when you go to your data tab, tons of lists you can look through, right? So I think this was under science. Yeah, roller coasters, right? So I've already got it imported. Of course, you would click import, but you can also just do preview. So if you pick some of these, if I previewed roller coasters, you can see what that data set contains. Okay, so this has the roller coaster name, the amusement parks, the city it's in, the country it's in, what region it's in, construction materials, and then I liked that it had some good numeric stuff here that the user could try to look at. Maybe what's the highest roller coaster, what's the fastest or the longest roller coaster, and which is maybe the shortest and the slowest and the least tall, right? The shortest. I also thought number of inversions is kind of cool, right? Inversions when you get flipped upside down. But notice there are a lot of zeros, so maybe I don't want to list the least number of inversions. Just technically that would be a lot of roller coasters here. But I like those categories. So the idea I had for my app after looking at my data set was I'm going to have a nice homepage that looks like this. I'm going to have a little introduction, learn what roller coasters have the greatest and least speed, heights, lengths, and greatest number of inversions. And then we have these nice buttons, least button and greatest button that will take us to my other screens. So in the greatest button, here's my greatest screen. Just got a text area. Please keep in mind, by the way, if you're using a text area, that's this one, text area, and you don't want the user to be able to delete text, you want them to just be able to read it, please make sure that you change your read-only property. Otherwise, the user will be able to delete stuff, which you don't want, right? We just want them to read the text that will be displayed here. So the way the user is going to interact or give us input is after they've come to this page, they're going to click on our drop-down menu, and it's got some options for them. They can select speed, height, length, number of inversions, and I'm going to want to do an on event when this drop-down is changed, meaning when they've picked a different value than the current one it's on. Then I'm going to want it to run a function that finds, goes through my list or traverses my list and finds in this case, the greatest or maximum speed, maximum height, maximum length, etc. So obviously we're going to be traversing a list and reducing to a single value here. Okay. So when you're selecting, a list, one of the original ones I looked at, I'll give you an example of something that was not necessarily good here. We were looking at, the World Cup just happened this year. Let's look at the data from the World Cup. So I was hoping, maybe we'd have number of goals or something like that. This is a pretty limited data set, right? First of all, it's a pretty short list, which is not terrible in itself. There's been 23 World Cups. But the only real numeric value here is the number of participating teams. I could maybe do a count and say like how many times has Uruguay or Italy won. And every time it comes to this, we count it up. Maybe you can do something like that in your app. That would be filtering, not reducing. I don't know. Yeah, there just wasn't a lot of data here for me to do this. So I thought this was not a good data set. So anyway, another one that was pretty good. You don't have to use this again. They did this. The nutrition ones are great, right? Just look at this: grams of protein, grams of fat, grams of sodium, and you've got tons of stuff that can go along with these. You even got the images of the box if you want to display a picture. So kind of cool. Anyway, look through those. Find something that you find interesting. I would suggest something that has numbers that you could compare. So I liked roller coasters. You choose what you like. So we're going to have to do a lot of things. And one of those first things is, of course, import your data. Select a data set and import, which I've done. Obviously I've got my design element done here. I've given everything meaningful names, right? Everything, home screen, right? Greatest screen's got the greatest header text or greatest header label. greatest image, greatest dropdown, greatest text output, greatest home button, etc. So make sure you're giving everything nice, meaningful names. Okay, so I know one of the things that we're going to have to do is create meaningful variables and store each necessary column as a list or an array. So I don't like to program with the blocks, so I like to type stuff out more. So we're going to define a variable, var, and one of the sets of data that I want to get from here was height, speed, and length. So let's do heights. So I like to use plural for things that are lists, because we know that means there's more than one in there. Var heights equal to, and we want to use get column. And this is actually one, now that I think about it, that it's better to do with the other, with blocks. Anyway, roller coasters is the data set, comma, choose, oops, not roller coasters. It seems to be confused. Let's do show blocks here. Let's just put some empty quotes. See if it'll let me switch. Okay. Yeah, show blocks, get columns, probably easier, to be honest. We'll do that. Okay, and for heights, we want to get the column height. So it's going to take all of that data that was stored in this column heights and store them all the way down like this, every single one of those numbers. And it didn't tell me specifically what these were measured in, but all these data sets have more info. So just to show you if maybe it didn't tell you, you can come here and see that height is measured in meters, right? Speed, kilometers per hour, length, meters, etc. So I can get my units here under more if you need to. And if you want to see the original source they get it from, you can go there as well. Okay, so let's go back to our code. Now, here's one of the nice things when you're doing without blocks is I know I'm going to want to do at least a couple more of these. But instead of heights, we're going to want to get the speeds. What was one of our other data sets? We wanted speed length, right? So let's do lengths. And obviously these will need to be different. So I'm going to go back to block mode. It's just easier to do a selection here. So it's the same data set, but the column I want for speeds is the speed column. The one I want for lengths is the length column. There's probably a few other things I'd like to get from here. We can come back and add them in as I go along. But I think I want to be able to tell the user what the coaster's name, what park it's in, the city, and what country it's in, right? I don't think I necessarily need to give them the region or construction material. I do want to do number of inversions, but maybe not years open or inversion. So let's do a few more of these. Let's get all of our data in. So again, I'm going to do some copy and pasting here. So there's at least three, I think 4 things I wanted, like cities, countries, I think was one of them. We wanted park names. So there's a reason I'm not using the word name. You might notice if you do var name, that it gives you an error, right? Redefinition of name. And that's because name is actually a reserved word. It's in JavaScript. So when you're naming things, you should avoid using certain words, reserved words, and one of them is name. So name is an object type in JavaScript, kind of like string is an object type. Anyway, it's an object that's predefined. So to avoid using name and getting that error, we're just going to go park names. I wanted the coaster names, right? And I wanted number of inversions. I need one more. Let's call that inversion counts. Okay. So we go back to blocks. We can select these new things. Cities, obviously we're going to change to city. Countries, we change to country. Let me do this quickly because I think you guys get the idea of what's happening here. Park names is amusement park. Coaster names is roller coaster name. And inversion counts is number of inversions. Inversion is just yes or no. Number of inversions is numeric. Okay, so given these all meaningful names, it's going to tell me we've got them all defined, but they're just not called in our program yet. Okay, that's perfect. Next, I give myself some leeway here to use this area to create any other global variables needed. So for instance, when we find the coaster that has the lowest height, we're going to want to store what city that's in, etc. So I might want to say var city equals an empty string, just so JavaScript knows it's a string type. Var country is an empty string. Var park name. Notice these are all singular, right? Because these will be reduced to single values when you report back to the user. Coaster name. Var coaster name is a blank string. Okay, I think that's it for now. We might need to come back and add a few things in here. Let's do the buttons to navigate first, right? So we can at least go back and forth here. So those on events are nice and easy to drag in. And this time I want this on event. I'll use blocks. This on event down here is going to be for, let's say on the home screen when they click the least button. When the least button is clicked, what do I want it to do? Well, I want it to do set screen. So it's down below. Set screen changes the screen. And what screen do we want? If they click the least button, we want to go to the least screen. Okay. So here's the text version of that. I'm just going to do copy and paste because I know I want one for the greatest screen. And each of these other screens has a button that brings us back home that I'm going to want to program as well, right? This home button to bring us back. That's important. Don't forget to give the users a way to go back and kind of restart your program. Or go back to the main page without having to like completely close it out. So on event, let's change these. When the greatest button, this is the one on the home page here. This is called greatest button is clicked. I want it to go to the greatest screen. And then the ones on my other screen, this is called the greatest home screen. Greatest home button. Take me back to the home screen. And this one, which is called least home button. Least home button. When that's clicked, take me back to the home screen. So I think we should have at least button functionality here. So the greatest page. And this is taking me to the least page. So that looks good. Okay, so we've got our on event buttons. Perfect. Let's take a look back in text what we have now. So some of the things we'll need to do, we're going to need to do some drop-down change events, right? When the user selects some of these drop-downs. So when they select this drop-down and change it, I want it to do some stuff. So I know I need to at least create on events for those. So let's drag in an on event for each of those things. And we go to blocks just to initially set them up here. So when the greatest dropdown not is clicked, but when its value is changed, when there's change in the greatest dropdown, I want it to run this function. And I have one on the least home screen, very similarly named, least dropdown. So see how easy this is when you give these meaningful names to everything, right? When the least dropdown is changed, I want it to do some more stuff. I want it to do my reducing, right? Find those single values. So given some comments here, what I want those to do, if there's a valid selection, meaning notice one of the selections here is called select a measurement, right? That's not really a valid selection, right? I don't want it to do anything when the user selects that. So I'll show you how we can roll that out. If there's a valid selection, gets the appropriate selected list. So those lists, remember we got from the data set. Finds the least or greatest value and updates the least text output, which should be this, or on their greatest page, the similar greatest text output. Okay, so a few things I'll need those to do. So let's also create some functions here. So to create a function, you say function, and then what you want its name to be. So let's call this maybe find the least. Open, close parentheses, open curly bracket. Now, again, you can just go to functions, function, my function, right? It's the generic from here to describe a function. I just typed out exactly what that would give you, except mine's not called my function. It's called find least. Let's also do one though called find greatest. So this is just telling me that it's defined, but it's never been called. That's fine. When the greatest dropdown happens, I want it to run this function. No, there's nothing in it yet. I know I want it to call that one, and when I call the least dropdown, I want it to call this function. Don't forget, when you're calling a function, it's your function's name, open, close parentheses, and then a semicolon. So this is calling those two functions. So I want to say when they pick the dropdown, and notice they've only got, for say the least here, 3 options. Okay. Oh, I see what I've done here. This is actually an extra function I was going to add in. So this is not the right space for these. This one's supposed to go and find the least value is down here and greatest value is down here. Just do a little copy and pasting. Put these underneath the correct comments I had added in. Okay, so we're going to ignore this middle one for a second. We can actually start to write some of these. So if I want to find the greatest, let's see. First of all, I need to get the user selection. I noticed that some of those things were in different units. I actually think I want to use a separate function, which is what this is, to get the user's input. So let's create a new function. Get input. Okay, so I'm going to use this for when the user does the drop-down change. Let's have it call get input first. Oops, not with the function name. And I'll actually want it to call that same thing even when it's doing the least dropdown. So I know I seem a little all over the place here. So why do I want the second get input? Okay, so when the dropdown changes, I want it to read the text from the dropdown. So let's create a variable. You know what, since this is going to be used, I might use that variable in both of these others. Let's make this a global variable. So I'm going to do that up here, and let's call it selection. Okay. So this is a global variable, just meaning I don't have to redefine it down here. I can just change its value. Sorry, let's get their selection from here. Selection equals get text. By the way, if you start doing this and you press the arrows down and press tab, usually it helps you. Okay, I guess it doesn't like me today, but I want to get the text from, this was called the greatest dropdown. Okay, it's going to get our text and store it as selection. So if this is, selected as height, I know I'm on the wrong page, but you get the idea. Selection should now have the string height with a capital H. Okay. So I want that to happen as well. Let's use selection. The reason I'm doing it here is because there are 2 different dropdowns, right? That I want to get my selection from. The greatest dropdown and the least dropdown, depending if we're using which dropdown we're changing, right? But I just want my selection to equal that no matter what. Okay. So in get input, let's say if selection is equal to height, you know what? I think we're going to say the list we want to find the lowest or highest value of would be heights, right? So let's create a new, maybe another global variable here. List to reduce. And because it's going to be an array, I'll just say it's an empty array to start. So if it's height, let's say list to reduce should equal heights. And remember, heights is what we stored that array, right? Our get column returns an array of all of those values. And so we're saying, hey, let's make our empty array equal to this array full of values, right? Let's say if selection equals speed, I want this to equal list to reduce equal speeds. Right, that's matching for our columns from above. If selection, and notice we're using double equal here to say if it equals exactly, and the spelling and capitalization in these strings has to match exactly what's in your dropdown. So if you want to be extra careful, you can always come in here and like click these and copy and paste, like copy and paste yours, so that the capitalization, the spelling, everything matches. Okay, if selection equals length, then I want the list we're going to reduce to equal lengths. If selection equals number of inversions, list to reduce equals inversion counts. Let's double check that. Yeah, inversion counts. By the way, double clicking will select like the whole word or variable. You can do copy and paste. You can see, by the way, that if you do that, if you select that variable, anywhere else in your programming code, it'll have like a little box around it. Okay, I know one of the other things that's going to change with these, right? Height, speed, and length were all measured in, well, two of these were measured in meters, height and length. Speed was measured in kilometers per hour. And number of inversions is just inversions, I guess, is the unit. So maybe we'll create a variable units. This maybe just help us. So another global variable here. And we'll just make it an empty string to start. I'll say units. So if it's height, let's make units equal to meters, right? Speed, what units was equal to kilometers per hour, I think it said. And if it's length, units equals meters. I could have copied and pasted this from above. And if it's inversions, let's make units equals inversions. Okay, I think I just want that so when I display the text to the user, I can say it's, this coaster has the least number of, or the smallest height, right, in meters, and give them the units. So it depends on what you want to display to your users. I think this is pretty good for get input. Okay, let's say now I want to find the greatest value, right? So let's see. First thing I want to do is get the first value of this. I know I'm definitely going to need a for loop. For I equals 0, semicolon goes here. I less than now. Because all of these columns have the same number of elements, I can select any of these names. So I'll just do coaster names. Really can be any of those. They should all have the same length. So as long as I is less than that, dot length. Notice not less than or equal to, just less than the length. Semicolon I plus plus. Increment I by 1. So as long as this condition is true, starting at 0, increase I by 1, and then check this condition, etc. So this should iterate through my entire list. Should have seen that before. Okay, the next thing we're going to do, what do I want to happen in here? I want to have some sort of variable called the maximum. Let's say R max equals, Now I don't want to start with 0 or a hard-coded value. Let's just assume that the very first value, and notice the list we're going to compare to, whatever we wanted to compare is now stored in a global variable called list to reduce. So let's assume that the largest value is the very first one in list to reduce. Remember, that's at index 0. So we're assuming that the largest one is at 0. Then we're going to say in my list, if list to reduce at index I, and remember I is going up every time we go through our for list. So this will be 0 and then 1 and then 2 and then 3. So it's checking all of these. If that value, because we're looking for the maximum, if the new value is greater than or equal to the current maximum, then we've got a new biggest value, right? So we need to say replace what's in max with list to reduce I, with our new value. So replace our current max with the new value if and only if it's greater than or equal to the current max. Okay. I think this is pretty good. Maybe I want this to create an output though, right? Let's create some sort of output here. So var output string equal to, so what do I want my string to say when we get a coaster back? It's a good idea. Let's see. Well, I think I'm going to want to have the coaster name. Ooh. Well, you know what? Once we find this maximum value, that index that we're looking at, remember when we go back to our data set, so let's say, you know, this Shamu Express is the maximum value of something, right? It's not looking at these columns, but let's pretend it is, right? Maybe it's, well, it's not even the middle. Anyway, let's pretend this is the one we're looking at though, right? So if I find this is the biggest value at that same index, it's going to be its country name, its city, park name, and ride name, right? Roller coaster name. So I think, remember we created some of these variables, like city, country, park name, coaster name. I think when we come back down here, so I'm going to copy those. I don't want to redefine them here, so I'm going to get rid of the var part. Don't worry, I'll show you a nice way of getting these all lined up again. Okay, these are already defined. If you select them all and then press tab, you can tap them in perfectly, multiple lines. Shift tab takes you backwards. So there's a little extra tip if you didn't know that. Let's say our city, I want the city I want to display to user to be the city at that same location. So remember, that's stored in the column called cities. Cities. So let's set city equal the city's value at that same address or index, right? Remember, this is kind of referring to the horizontal column in our data, right? Like if saying if this is the maximum value, look at the list where I stored cities and grab that value, right? So same address, same value I. And it's only going to do that if we found a new maximum, right? Or if it's equal to, right? Remember we said this, maybe this first one is the largest. So we're going to do something similar here. Country equals countries I. That was the name of the list that we created before. Same thing with park names I. Remember, I made all my lists plural, so that helps me remember how I named them here. And I think this was coaster names I. Oh, we're missing an unmatched something or other. Oh, I think it's because this wasn't finished. So let's create our output string. I want it to have my park name. What do I want this to say? My park name. So like Shamu Express. Let's concatenate. This plus is just continuing my string here. Plus some text. Let's do a space, so it's not right up against my park name. In, let's say at. Let's say it's at the amusement park. Let's do the park name. Oh wait, this was coaster name. My apologies. Yeah, I want the coaster name. So Shamu Express was the coaster name, not the park name. At park name, which was, you know, in our example here, Shamu Express was at SeaWorld San Antonio. So Shamu Express at SeaWorld San Antonio has the greatest speed or something, right? So let's continue on this our thought here. Space has the greatest, and then will either be speed or length or height, depending on what they did. Remember, we actually stored that in a global variable called selection. So I'm going to say add the selection has the greatest selection, height, speed, number of inversions, right? Whatever they picked from the dropdown. Now it is going to put some capital letters in the middle of my sentence, right? Like the capital letters here. I can show you a way around that, but let's leave it for right now. Has the greatest number of blank, has the greatest height of the greatest height at, and then let's do the maximum, right? The number stored is stored in maximum, right? The number that we were comparing. So it's the greatest, height at blank. Let's put a space in here, and then let's do units. I know this is very long. In fact, one thing you can do when you're defining a string is you can go down to the next line. So let's do units, and then let's do like a period or something at the end. Concatenate. There you go. So I think what this is going to say is equals our coaster name. Shamu Express at SeaWorld San Antonio has the greatest height or speed at, let's say maybe it had the greatest height. Right, we'll go back to our data set here. Let's say I think this was height here, 22.68. Has the greatest height at 22.68 meters. This is the greatest selection, which would be height, at our value 22.68 space meters, period. I think that looks pretty good. So I think we've got the correct string going here. And now let's put that string in this box. So how do we do that? We're going to set the text. Set the text of this field, which was called the greatest text output. That's the element I want to set the text of, and then the text I want to put in there is stored at this string. Output string. Okay, so we just did a lot of stuff. I was being pretty lenient, not stopping and testing things and logging them to the console or using my watchers. A lot of programming confidence here that, is probably misplaced. So let's see. Let's try speed. Top Thrill Dragster at Cedar Point has the greatest speed. Well, we didn't put in there the city and the country, right? At Cedar Point in, so let's do that. Plus in sometimes it gives you the double quotes, you gotta delete one. In city plus, what do I want after city? Maybe a comma there. Plus country plus, let's put this down at the next line. We'll move the other stuff over. Plus country has the greatest selection at, okay, let's try this. Greatest speed. Top Thrill Dragster at Cedar Point in Sandusky, USA has the greatest speed at 194.4 kilometers per hour. That's really good, actually. Let's try height. That's the same one as the greatest height at 128.60 meters. What about length? Beast at Kings Island in Kings Mills, USA has the greatest length at 2,243 meters. The only thing I don't like, right, I think this reads really nicely actually, is that length has this capital L. Well, anything that's stored as a string has some things that you can put on them. Like if you want to turn everything to lowercase, I'm going to show you how to do that. So in this case, it's the selection that's giving me this capital L. So if I want to force anything in the string of selection to be lowercase, this is a cool trick. You put dot to, and notice, look at this, it's starting to give me to lowercase. And because this is a function, or a function that we're calling on this object, this string object. Anyway, you put these open and close parentheses afterwards. No semicolon there, because otherwise it'll think we're ending our string. But just .to lowercase. And now check this out. When I go to height, has the greatest height. Notice height now is lowercase. It just forces all characters in that string to be lowercase. So it's pretty cool, right? If you want to get rid of capitalization somewhere. Okay, well, the good news is I just did half of my program, right? As far as this function. In fact, most of this stuff I'm going to want when I find the least as well. So I'm going to copy and paste. But maybe instead of max, let's do min. And we go to find the least, we're going to assume that the minimum value is the first one in our chosen list to reduce. Now remember, lists to reduce will either equal speeds or lengths or inversion counts based on what the user's selection from the dropdown is, right? Okay, so var min. Now this case, I still want it to go through the same length of arrays, right? It's still the same length. So I'm just using generically coaster names. It can be any of the lists that we did up top. These all have the same length, right? The same number of data. So do that for all of these data, go through the list. And in this case, what I want to check, if the new item I'm looking at is less than or equal to the minimum value, if it's smaller or equal to the minimum value, let's replace the minimum value with the new item. Let's grab that city name at the same index stored in cities. Let's grab the country name at the same index in countries, etc. Right, a lot of this was similar, so copy and paste just saved me a lot of typing, a lot of typos that could happen. If you're going to become a good programmer, copy and paste is your friend. Okay, so my output string, I still wanted to say the coaster name at the park and the city, comma, country has the least height, right? Or number of inversions, or whatever. I don't think that one's in here, but you get the idea. The least blank. At instead of max, we've changed this to min units. Let's see if that quick copy and paste and few changes just fix this. Oh no, we're running into an error. It's not working. Why is it not working? Well, let's check. Okay, find least should be called. Get input should be called. Selection equals get text of the least dropdown. That should be what it's called, right? Let's double check. Least dropdown. When the least dropdown is changed, make sure to make a typo here or something. Yep, copy paste, least dropdown. Get the text from least dropdown. Get input. If selection equals any of these things, speed, height, or length, should go through and do some of this stuff. Okay, so I made a new variable minimum. We should have the new list to reduce, the new units. So let's check. Okay, let's put that in our watch, our list to reduce. So it should just be empty until I've changed this dropdown, right? Okay, so it's getting the correct list to reduce. It's coming in here, going through this whole list. If the new item is less than the current minimum, then replace minimum with that new item and grab all these values. Here's the problem. It's actually doing everything awesome, except where is it changing the text? On the other page, on the greatest page. So this is one of the things you got to look out for, right? So you can see some troubleshooting, looking at watchers, figuring out, if I got up to this point, what was working, what wasn't working. I think we just did some problem solving. Let's see. Aha, there we go. So St. Gemini at Cedar Point in Sandusky, USA has the least speed, the slowest one for all of you guys that get dizzy, at 9.72 kilometers per hour. Nice and light one. This one in Buenos Aires, it's only 3 meters high. That's pretty short. And the shortest length is Montana Raton at Graje Villa in Lima, Peru. All right. So I think all of our buttons work. Our code works. We want to go in and add nice comments to make sure users understand what all of these things are. Hopefully this helped. I know I might have made my life more complicated by involving things that had different units. But here's at least a nice process you can use to try to work around those if you have something similar. Make sure, again, when you're picking a data set, that you're picking something that has lots of numbers, because that's going to make the comparison and stuff easier, etc. So just to show you some of my programming guide, I knew the data columns that I wanted. I listed those out here. I reduced my list to a single value. Remember, that's not filtering, that's reducing. Explaining in detail, notice here this is very generic. This app, not my app, or this app is really cool, or right, just go very robotic. This app can find the roller coaster with the greatest speed, length, height, or number of inversions, or least speed, length, and height. The user will be informed of the corresponding coaster's name, the amusement park, city, country, and the least or greatest value and its use measure, right? So it's to help people find, the least or greatest stat of a roller coaster. Okay, so pretty generically. So I wanted you to kind of put your design. So you can see my design here is pretty basic. I just did this in Google Drawings. You can do this obviously on a piece of paper, but this is kind of the rough outline of what I wanted to do. I've got my buttons mapping to what they're supposed to do. The drop downs obviously aren't mapping to anything but code. And I had some idea what I wanted my outputs to look like. So here's all of the different names. What do those things do? Everything had a meaningful name. Coaster, home, label. What type is it? It's a label, right? That's what you selected when you designed it. And it displays the main title of the main screen, right? I mean, that's super generic. That's this, right? So you put all of the elements, making sure they have these nice names, including your images, right? Then it says Boolean expressions. These are like your if statements, right? Things that evaluate to true or false. So if my stat is greater than or equal to max, replace max with the current statistic, store and update corresponding names like city name, city, etc., right? Park name or coaster name, etc. The notes is that it was inside of a for loop that traverses the appropriate list. They love the word traverses, right? We traverse a list when we go through it. List or array, those are synonyms. If stat is less than or equal to, this is very similar, right? Replace it with the new one and update our info. Okay, the for loop. So I've just copied and pasted my for loop in here from one of those, right? This is the maximum one. And then my notes, so it traverses the matching list. The user is selected from the dropdown to look for the greatest or max value. Then at your on events, you have your buttons, what screen they're setting it to. So on the least home button, click, the screen is set to home screen. Least button, click, the screen is set to least screen. Greatest dropdown, change, the app will get the user selection. Ooh, this is right, we didn't do the if valid, right? So let's go back. I'll show you how to make sure that it's valid. So the other thing that both of these had was select a measurement, right? As an option the user can select. So I'll show you how to make sure that this is correct. We can say when they change the dropdown, get the text from the selection, right? Get the text from the dropdown. We're going to say if selection does not equal select a measurement. So if it's anything else, right, from that dropdown menu, then go ahead and get the input and find the greatest. Okay. If it is select a measurement, if they selected that, it's going to skip over these, right? And never run them. So it's not going to update the screen. It might change selection temporarily, but the user won't see anything. So I'm going to copy and paste this below here. I'm going to say, hey, only do this stuff after you get the selection. That's important. I need to get that value first to do this comparison. Select multiple lines and tap them in. So if it's not select a measurement, then do these things, right? So now when I come in, if I do speed and then I click select a measurement, notice it's not changing, right? It's not giving me an error either down here on the console, which is really nice. Otherwise, if I didn't put that in and the user went back and selected select a measurement, it would give me an error. Nothing would change here. The user, on the front end might not see the error, but it is causing an error technically. Sorry, so forgot how to do that, or forgot to mention that. Okay, so these are my functions. Get selected list. Actually, this was get input, right? Find least, find greatest, right? And what they do. So the purpose of get input is to make sure when comparing the proper data column, it updates units for text output. How it works. We'll check if the user's drop-down selection equals something like heights. If so, it sets list to compare. Ooh, this was changed it, right? It's not list to compare. It was list to reduce. Let's update that. List to reduce, etc. I know I have that somewhere else in here. Anyway, we go through and traverse through our list. It changes the units and sets it to the correct data column. All right, so make sure you describe what each of these things do. Then you got your build phase and the key here. The other thing we're going to see is the written response. So I'm going to talk about that really quickly. I know this video is super long. This app is designed to inform users which roller coasters around the world have the greatest speed, height, length, etc. It will inform users of the coaster's name, amusement park, city, country, statistic, and what units the statistic was measured in. Okay, that's the purpose of my program. It's going to inform users about roller coasters that have these things, right? Question 2, insert screenshots of 2 program code segments which contain a list being used in your program. The first program code should show how the data has been stored. So I just copied these ones that we got, right? This might have been the previous version of the program I wrote, but you get the idea. I just did a screenshot on a Windows computer. That's Windows Shift S. And then you select whatever you want, make a little box around it. And that will copy to your clipboard. You can actually just, in a data set, go to something right now and just hit paste. Right, you can see it's copied that in there again from my screenshot. The second program code segment should show how the data is being in the list is being used, such as creating new data or from existing data or accessing multiple items in the list. So I showed here the little segment from selection. If the selection is heights, list to compare equals heights. So we can see that that list is now being stored over here. And then I gave part of my for loop here, right? List to compare. I think ours was list to reduce, but you get the idea. I called it list to compare here. I should probably fix that. But next, what is the name of the list? Was heights. Okay, so this is a written response that identifies the name of the list being processed. So heights is one of them. What data is contained in the list? So heights of roller coasters around the world measured in meters. Explains how the list manages complexity in your program. So this is important. Now notice, if we just think about what does that mean? If we look back at our data and we're looking at heights, look at all these values. I could create a new variable that had each roller coaster's name as maybe as the variable. I could say like Frashbahn height is a variable and store 3.3. Percy's Railway height, 30.48, right? I'd have to do that for all of these coasters. There's a lot of them, 257 of them. So I'd have to have 257 pieces of data to store all of those numbers. So how does this list, sorry, let me get back to it here. How does this list manage our complexity? Well, to store each roller coaster's heights along with other statistics would require a lot of variables and an enormous amount of if statements to compare them all, right? How would I find the largest one? I'd have to do like 1 million if statements. It'd be really hard, right? So the list manages by complexity by making it much easier to traverse and reduce, they love these words, with a loop and if statements, right? Having them in that list makes it so much easier to have that gigantic number of variables stored somewhere, right? Since they're all similar, they're all heights of these different coasters, having them in a list makes our life much easier. So it's looking for an explanation like that, right? It requires a lot of variables, an enormous amount of if statements to compare them. Having them all stored in a list makes it much easier to traverse, and in this case, reduce with a loop and if statement, specifically a for loop. Okay, then it says, question 3, insert a screenshot of a function definition from your program. So I did the find least function, right? Pretty similar to the one we just wrote. Write a description that describes in general what the identified procedure does and how it contributes to the overall functionality of the program. So what does our function do? It reduces a chosen list to the minimum value for a for loop, then stores all relevant information, creates a string to be output, and updates the output text field, right? That's kind of looking at what all of these things did. How does the function contribute to the overall functionality of our program? Well, finding the least is like half of the thing, almost half the thing I need my program to do, right? So this function does half the purpose of the program, traversing a data set and finding the least of a statistic and reporting the corresponding info back to the user about the roller coaster. So, I mean, how does that help me in the functionality? It helps me out a lot, right? I could have maybe talked about this specific one that we wrote, right? Get input. How did that help us? Well, it helped us by being able to display the correct units and grabbing the correct list. So I didn't have to write all of these if statements multiple times inside of our greatest function and least function, right? So having this made my life a little bit easier. You can pick pretty much any function, and why does that function help you in your program? Okay, so that's what they're looking for in the written response. Anyway, I know this video is crazy long. Thank you guys for, if you're still awake, hopefully this helped you get an idea of some things that you can do. Make sure you get your data, store it. Global variables are always really good for smaller programs like this. Create your on event buttons, right? Make sure that that functionality works pretty early on. Maybe you can do that right after you get your data set. For me, I use dropdowns. So when the dropdowns are changed, run these different functions, right? And then make sure, of course, we have by reducing functions, find the greatest, find the least, and make sure that you output your text using set text. You can get the values from your dropdowns using get text from your dropdown. Anyway, I hope that helped. Thanks, guys.